Welcome to the Hall Center for the Humanities. My name is Andy Denning. I'm an assistant professor of history here at KU. I'm pleased to be able to introduce and enjoy the talk of Professor Iain McCalmon. If you were at the wonderful talk last night, you got to hear my dear colleague Gregory Cushman give a wonderful introduction with lots of context. I will try to pare that down a bit so that we can get right to Iain's talk. Iain McCalmon is professor of history at the University of Sydney. Finished his PhD at Monash University, also in Australia. He described himself a few minutes ago as a historical dilettante. I'd like to think that he has wide-ranging interests and covers many fields. So he's worked in the history of British radicalism, of European Romanticism, and as I hope you saw last night, a wonderful environmental and cultural history of the Great Barrier Reef. Today he's going to be sharing some of his new research with us. The title of this talk is Back to the Future, Teddy Roosevelt's Anthropocene. So please join me in welcoming Professor Iain McCalmon.
Thanks very much, and also you're the first people I've ever talked about this work. It's so fresh, the ink is, still wet. And it's just the beginning of a new book. So what I'm going to do is I don't want to read out a paper, but I'm going to read a page of this paper, which is the beginning, the prologue of the book. And the book is really about Roosevelt and the circle of hunters that he was involved with in Africa. And I trace, so it's really a kind of interconnected story about 4 or 5 families, women, men, and children, and the impact of hunting on them, as well as the impact of hunting on the poor, benighted animals. So first I just want to explain how I got involved in this project. So I'll give you one page of the prologue, which will explain that, and then show a few little slides and chat about the way the book is going to go. We can talk about the Anthropocene idea of the safari, and just talk about the whole project. I'm interested in being interrogated about the book. I've just reached the point of having written a full proposal, so it's gone out to my agent, and it'll come to the American agent soon. Those proposals are mine's 60 pages long, so they're much harder than the usual book proposals that you do as an ordinary academic writing to Oxford University Press or whatever. For a start, they expect a summary of every chapter, even if you haven't written the book. So it's kind of testing. Anyway, let's begin without any ado. The prologue is called Shooting an Elephant. Around Christmas every year in the British Central African colony of Nyasaland, my mother would bring out 4 strange little bowls or dishes filled with raisins, nuts, and chocolates. She called them bonbon dishes, giving the words a kind of posh inflection. Bonbon dishes. Oval-shaped, they appeared to be made from tortoiseshell that had aged the tawny colour of wild African honey. Musa, our servant, had always given the silver rims and the round ball silver feet a special Christmas polish. I think we may have a picture of one in this. Let's see, by the end of the... Scratched on the side of each in dark lettering were the words LJT from TR. LJT was Leslie Jeffress Tarleton, my great-uncle, and TR was Teddy Roosevelt. My sister and I loved the annual family ritual when Christmas dinner guests, heavily primed with liquor, were asked to guess at the dish's origins. Nobody ever got it right. Would giggle with delight at the wrinkled noses that followed my father's revelation that the dishes were the toenails of an elephant cow shot by Theodore Roosevelt on safari in British East Africa. Roosevelt, Dad would elaborate, had given these mementos to Dad's uncle, Leslie Jeffress Tarleton, an Australian, to thank him for helping to guide and outfit the 11-month safari, and also for preventing TR's reckless son Kermit Roosevelt from accidentally killing himself and others all around him. The dishes had been passed down to my father with a couple of other relics of the same safari, including a shotgun and the folding wooden table on which TR scribbled his best-selling memoir, African Game Trails. Dad later painted this table a lurid blue. Dad, I have to say, has no reverence for these objects. He made the table a lurid blue to make it visible in the brown elephant grass where we sometimes camped. Like Mum, he tended to speak about the table, the shotgun, and the elephant dishes in the same half-indulgent, half-satirical tone that accompanied all mention of artefacts associated with the early British Raj. Things like, by the 1960s, elephant toenail souvenirs had come to seem as absurd as they were grotesque. Part of a lost world of puce-faced colonels with pith helmets, monocles, and shooting sticks. The world, in fact, out of which I was made. So that's the origin, in a sense, of my interest in this story, I suppose. And the objects, in a sense, they're quite beautiful until you know what they are. And then they just seem really grotesque. So what I first did, just out of interest, was to track the elephant that was shot, to find out what happened to that particular elephant and why she was killed. And that is what led me to the book. The story of the elephant being killed is a story of two safaris meeting in Kenya in 1910. One was run by Carl Akeley, who's the great taxidermist, who produced the dioramas in the American Museum of Natural History, if you've been there, amazing African hall dioramas. And he had a small safari, and Roosevelt had this massive safari. I mean, he was going on holiday, allegedly a small hunting holiday, after he had been in office to sort of get away from the mire of politics. The hunting holiday turned into the biggest expedition that has ever been mounted in Africa, because that's what Teddy Roosevelt was like. Napoleonic in his ambitions, it is an understatement. He persuaded, basically blackmailed, the Smithsonian Washington Institution into making it a safari of science as well, in order for him to be able to cover the fact that he wanted to kill many more animals than he was technically allowed to do. Anyway, these two safaris met up because Carl Akeley, in trying to sort of butter up Roosevelt at one dinner before they left, had said, "Would you shoot an elephant for me to go to the American Museum of Natural History, where he was going to make an elephant group, mother, father, a calf, so sort of 3 in all, I suppose." But he asked Roosevelt to shoot one elephant, and Roosevelt was absolutely thrilled, largely because, as Carl Akeley said, this elephant will be there out in the front of the museum with your name on it as the hunter. So I tracked the safari. It was 4 men. I mean, the safari group met. There were a larger number of people and went out to hunt the elephant. The 4 men went out to hunt it. It was Roosevelt himself, his son Kermit, my great uncle Leslie Tarleton was leading the expedition, and Carl Akeley to get this elephant, and they duly tracked the elephants, a group of elephants that they knew were there. There were 8 cows, 8 elephant cows with calves. And first of all, you need to know that it was regarded as taboo almost to shoot elephant cows or cows of any kind, because they are they maintain the herd. They're the way it is a sustainable, that hunting can be sustainable. So first of all, the shooting of cows was a little bit of a no-no. Anyway, Roosevelt, by the time they got there, he was already determined to shoot 2 elephants, even though Akeley's heart sank. And his heart sank further and further as they went on this expedition to find the elephants, because he realized that Roosevelt was utterly indiscriminate when he hunted. He just blasted away at any animal that was in front of him. And the more the merrier. And of course, Akeley wanted to get perfect elephants for his family group, and his big worry was that they would get some kind of nondescript little elephants, and then Roosevelt would insist on having these displayed. Anyway, sure enough, there were this little group of elephant cows, and first of all, my uncle had great difficulty persuading Roosevelt to stalk. He didn't like stalking. That's not what men did. It's a womanly thing to stalk an enemy. You should rush out at them, blasting away. So anyway, he did persuade him to stalk. He persuaded him that they were going to, then he should shoot an elephant from behind this white ant hill. No, says TR. And he marches out straight up to the elephant herd and starts blasting away. So he shoots 2 cows instantly, wounds them, they fall. And of course, the herd charges, or at least a elephant cow charged the herd. So then they shoot that one as well. Then they shoot a calf. So at the end of it, 1 elephant had turned into 4 elephants. All of which, in Akeley's secret opinion, were too small for his display. But he had to congratulate Roosevelt on his magnificent achievements in blasting these elephants, which he typically wounded 3 or 4 times before they actually died. I don't think it was a single animal on any of the 512 large animals that he and his son killed on that expedition. I don't think anyone actually died instantly. They were all wounded and died rather agonizingly over a long period. So, I mean, the smallest cow, the one that had charged them, was so small that Akeley said, look, we can't use this one in my display, even though he never intended to use the other 2 either, and didn't. But he said, we'll use it for trophies, because of course trophies are what it's all about. Roosevelt had denied any interest in trophies because his trophy hall was already full at Sagamore House, but in fact he got rid of a whole lot, and in fact he got a monstrous number of trophies. And so they divided up the elephant into bits. This is the elephant. They skinned the 2 elephants that night, and they left this one, which was going to not be used. They just left it there, and in the night, animals attacked it. When Roosevelt arrived the next morning, there was a hyena with its head trapped, still alive, sticking out of the side of this elephant, because it had eaten its way in and couldn't get out. So he took a photograph of it and then shot it. The hyenas had already also eaten the toenails of this elephant, to some extent gouged it. But Roosevelt was then given the bottom of the elephant's leg for a wastepaper basket, and part of other bits of the elephant for various other kinds of trophies, strips of skin and so on. But because it had been too badly damaged by the hyenas, they took the they took the bowls out, and so he was sent them to Roland Ward, where they were turned into these trophies and eventually given to my uncle. But the reason it provoked me to want to write a book about this was, first of all, I was puzzled. I had come to know that Roosevelt was one of the great conservationists in American history, which is true. A man who described himself as a naturalist, who had written lots and lots of books on naturalism. A man who described himself as a naturalist and an animal and nature lover. His book, African Game Trails, has a little prefix. It says, he loved the great game as if he were their father. So what's the explanation for this particular mode of killing? I mean, it's actually atypical of hunters. He had no sense of, he did not seem to care at all if the animals were wounded or hurt. And he really wanted to maximize the number of animals he killed. So, I mean, he killed way beyond any quota, because there was a quota of animals in the that are imposed on all hunters in East Africa. By the time he killed this elephant, he'd already killed 11. You're supposed to only have one. It's supposed to be one bull elephant. That's your allocation. This is in 1910. Instead, he already had 11 animals killed, and then they killed another 3. So first of all, that was the puzzle to me. And then I also looked at the various people around him. The people who were there in the camp that day have become part of the larger story. What happens to them? I'm particularly interested in a number of women who were involved as hunters and became revolted by it, and why they did and how they did and what that happened. Because I want to argue that this expedition, and the 4, it's a very bad picture, but the 4 people in it are sort of symbolic of what Roosevelt was trying to do. There's Roosevelt, his son Kermit, and there's, on the one side is Selous, the great famous hunter and conservationist, and on the other side is Sir Frederick Jackson, who was the governor of East Africa and also a conservationist and ornithologist. And I wanted to tell the story, which is a story about how, in fact, that safari created the safari business. The professional safari business came into being because of Roosevelt's safari. And it was my great uncle who brought it into being. It's called N&T, Newland and Tarleton. And they dominated the safari business until the war, and then they collapsed and founded another one, Safariland. And they took everyone, from Edward VIII, as he was, the Prince of Wales, the 2 future kings, all the tycoons, Eastman, Kodak, the Vanderbilts, all these people, and of course, culminating in Ernest Hemingway. So what I wanted to do in the book is to explore what it was that drove Roosevelt and other men to kill animals, and what it was that made some of them, both men and women, grow disgusted by the process by the end of their lives and become major conservationists. So that's the story I'm trying to tell in the book. So I think that'll do for an introduction. I'll just flip through these. There's this first picture. Then we've got, that's Selous. There's a huge correspondence between Roosevelt and hunters in Africa. It starts in 1908 and is hundreds and hundreds of letters building up this safari, which was going to start with 2 people, ending up ended up having 560 porters to carry, 6 people to carry even Roosevelt's own objects, 3 people to carry his tent, and 1 to carry the flag, and 3 people to carry all the guns, and another to carry the books that he brought with him. So there's Selous was one of the big figures who he corresponded with. That's Jackson, the Governor General. The interesting thing about Selous is meant to have been the Alan Quatermain, the model for Alan Quatermain in Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines. And this guy is Good, who's also in King Solomon's Mines, who has a monocle. And they just happen to be sitting on either side, symbolically, of Roosevelt as he marches on an American train into what he said was the Pleistocene, going back into the Pleistocene on this American train, chugging into the future, announcing that one of his missions, he was nostalgic about the fact that the West had ended and bison had disappeared. But one of his missions, he said, was to help civilize this country. So in a sense, he was trying to bring the civilization, bring the Anthropocene in on this train as he trundled along, whilst being nostalgic about being in the Pleistocene. So it's a kind of movement in geological epochs in the same man. That's his son Kermit. Of great significance in this story because he'd brought Kermit along because he was the sensitive, weedy one of the 4 sons who hung around his mother far too much, apparently, for Roosevelt's taste. And he wanted to turn him into a proper masculine man, which he certainly succeeded in doing. That's Kermit in later safaris and hunting safaris and things that he undertook. In fact, Kermit was permanently affected by going on the safari. He became absolutely fanatical fighter in war, which was the whole purpose. What I discovered about why Roosevelt attacked large animals like a warrior was that he believed that it was the best way in peacetime for men to restore their masculinity. That what you were doing when you were shooting animals was testing out yourself for war. And that's the message that he gave to his son. So much so that when Kermit in the Second World War had become so drunken and also damaged by malaria and everything, he had to be demobbed by the army. He couldn't cope with it, so he blew out his brains because he saw it as having let his father down. When the 4 boys set off for the First World War, Roosevelt sent them off. They were all avid hunters. When he sent them off, he actually said, "I hope one at least of you will be killed or seriously wounded in the interests of the glory of American patriotism." There's Roosevelt standing over a lion. That's my uncle on the left, great uncle on the left, Leslie Tarleton. That's the other leader of a guy called R.J. Cunningham. There's Roosevelt and Kermit on top of a buffalo. Buffalo caused a particular problem because when they were shooting the buffalo, they wounded 2 of them and left them. They didn't follow it up. Again, this was one of the greatest taboos of hunting. If you wounded an animal, you had to follow it up and kill it for 2 reasons. One, out of humanity for the animal. The other reason is that if you didn't, if they lived, they became rogue. because they were damaged, and so that's one of many of the lions that had been, been hit by hunters and not killed. He left 2 buffalo to die, and they were found by a photographer who took photos of it, and Roosevelt had to bribe the man not to publish them. There he is beside an elephant. I'm not sure if that is the elephant with the toenails. I think not. It looks a little bit big for the little cow that he shot that day. And that's the sort of group of people who are part of this story, with Kermit at the end, Kermit beside him. We inherited a shotgun from Roosevelt that he'd taken on that safari. And my father, who was a big game photographer and a vet who hated hunting actually, had this gun, and I pestered him as a kid because all my mates went hunting. This is Africa, and I pestered him to take us hunting, and eventually he gave in one day and we went sailing on Lake Nyassa, which is a big lake, 365 miles long, 50 miles wide and 3/4 of a mile deep. Anyway, we were supposed to be hunting a duck, and there were hippo all around. I could also see a croc. And I was filled with funk. I was actually terrified of guns. Held it limply in my hands, and the boat jibed. It was a sailing boat, and it tapped me on the back, and I dropped it in the lake. So it went to the bottom of the lake. That's where it lies. I was slightly chagrined a few years later to discover that his other shotgun sold in 1979 for $800,000. So it goes. Yeah. So that's the prologue. The point about that is that my father didn't give a damn. He grew up in that, he grew up in that culture, but had learnt to love animals, not hate them. And I want to tell the story of people who made those transitions, so that's why I have it as the prologue. Otherwise, we're out of the story. It's a story really about Roosevelt and that circle. Particularly interested in the impact of hunting on people's psyche, what it does to them, what it did to them. That's one of the big things I'm trying to explore in the book.
Thank you, Iain. So we're going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. We're going to have some staff members walking around with microphones. Please do speak into the microphone so that we can get this for the AV as well. So are there any questions for Professor Macalmon?
Well, you're probably aware of a book written by a woman who actually graduated from Baker, River of Doubt.
Yes.
And I just wondered, so it's sort of a Kansas connection for us in a certain way. But I just, the two journeys are different, and yet there must be some kind of connections, and I'd be interested to hear you talk about that.
Yes, that's a very interesting story, because in a sense it solidifies the importance of the adventure, the hunting adventure. I mean, they weren't really hunting, they were exploring on the River of Doubt. And of course he brought Kermit to take him on there, because they had become forged very closely by this hunting, this sort of, what it was an induction. The first safari was an induction for Kermit into manhood. They was very worried. For example, Kermit was an aesthete, actually. He was poetic, rather introverted, and the African porters called him Buona Maradadi or Buona Maladadi, which means dandy or in Swahili. And it was quite clear in letters that Roosevelt was worried that the boy wasn't manly enough. In fact, he was so taken with his father's story and examples. He was utterly reckless. Utterly reckless. I mean, he got Kermit got one of the native bearers killed by a leopard by shooting it in a silly way when he shouldn't have done so. He also took his own life in peril. I mean, he would gallop over the plains, which are all pitted with potholes, firing like the buffalo hunters, firing at lion, while he's galloping along on the side. Because it doesn't kill lion. So other people had to rescue him. So anyway, Kermit was taken and saved Roosevelt's life on... Kermit is a really sad story. I mean, I think he's a tragic man. And I think he was destroyed by his father. And the River of Doubt is another example of it, because the effect it had on Kermit, it was a really seriously difficult expedition, and Roosevelt nearly died. Kermit himself got very bad fever, and that fever then plagued him for the rest of his life. He started drinking because of the fever, became an alcoholic. But it was also so intensely imbued with this fighter ethos that when the First World War broke out, he instantly joined up with the British Army because he was afraid that the American army might not go into the war. So in order to get as much war as possible, he instantly joined up. And he was very brave in an utterly reckless way that was also Roosevelt's way of just barging in and, the charge up Kettle Hill in the Spanish-American War was the greatest, most ecstatic moment in Roosevelt's life. He always said that. And so he's trying to replicate that. But by the time he did the River of Doubt, he's already 52 in this safari. He's overweight, he's lame, his leg has been damaged, he's half blind. In one eye, he's completely blind, really, in one eye. So he had no sense, actually. Neither sense nor sensibility. So I think the River of Doubt story is a kind of dramatic extension of this safari. And certainly for Kermit, it's a major moment in his destruction, because I think that's what happens. I sort of at the moment have a story at the end, at the sort of last chapter, of three victims, as I see it, of this safari, and they're the second generation. One is a monkey that was adopted and became a sort of surrogate child, and I tell the story of why that monkey is a victim. I tell the story of why Kermit is a victim. And the third one was a little girl called Alice Bradley, who was taken on safari by her parents from Chicago when she was 5. And then they took her to the Congo. They went to the wildest parts of the Congo. Then the next time when she was 8, they went to another place in the Congo where they did live with cannibals and so on for a while. And she saw the most horrific things. Now, mother was a socialite and a writer who made a great deal out of taking this daughter. The daughter became a kind of famous figure. Again, totally damaged by the safari. And she ends up, after a very tumultuous and difficult life, with a very despairing, bleak, black view of the world as a cruel place. But she writes science fiction under a pseudonym, James Tiptree Jr. You know James Tiptree Jr.? And though that science fiction is in many ways a kind of galactic expression of her experiences with aliens whom she loves. Her stories are often about aliens, both in sense animals and Africans, whom she thought one should love, not hate. But she's another victim in that sense of a kind of safari parents, I suppose. It's a long answer to your.
You I assume are aware of the great publicity that occurred in this country of the game hunter this last year, the dentist
Yes.
in Minnesota. Would you care to comment on as you're trying to understand or to articulate, to help understand what motivates or what is driving these people? I'd be interested in your observation.
That's a great question. It was almost, it was a horrible event when the dentist shoots the lion and with a crossbow, and of course the lion didn't die. They had to eventually shoot it. So again, it's the whole business of suffering. A harmless lion, harmless in the sense of beloved by photographers and beloved by lots of people. But the crossbow is interesting because in the aftermath of Roosevelt's safari, I have a chapter on the stunt safaris that occurred, all from America, by people like this. There was one with bows and arrows. They didn't use crossbows, but they were famous bowmen in the States, and they decided that you could kill lion and elephants and so on with bows and arrows. Well, my uncle had two hunters go with them to finish off, because the animals would be full of pin-cushioned with these awful arrows, and of course they wouldn't die. So eventually my great uncle had banned them from doing any further hunting of large game. But there were a whole lot of these stunt safaris. There were people who tried to shoot from balloons. There were people who tried to use lariats and Western cutting horses to catch lion. And almost all of them were publicity seekers. Almost all of them were demonstrating the lost West. In some sense, it was a nostalgic thing. The West had ended. No longer are there cowboys. America has lost its male violence. It's this wonderful induction into manhood that came from the West, and so there's this Western nostalgia, which again I think this dentist guy half represents, and that this idea that, which again I think was very much instilled by Roosevelt, that the ultimate thing that a man can do is kill a lion or kill an elephant. These two incredibly dangerous, powerful animals, and so demonstrate their superiority and their masculinity. So I think it's a very good example of why I in fact think it's still important to write this book. Because, can I tell you one other story? A hunting story. So I went, I was out in the very far north, very remote part of Australia to do some filming on a lost settlement, a settlement that was closed down very early on in the 1840s because they couldn't survive there. But there's a sort of lost settlement all grown over. And the Aboriginal rangers took me there and came back. We had a barbecue. And, what's that? Okay. They said, it's very difficult for us to survive. We don't get enough money. So every year we accept one hunter. And I said, what do they hunt? And he said, bantang. Now, bantang are Indonesian cattle that went wild. Yeah, and there's there's a herd of, I think they're almost extinct in Indonesia, but there are 3,000 bantang. But they're cows. I mean, when you land, they have to shoo them off the paddock, and so, but they've gone right to the top of the hunting, because of their rarity, and technically they're wild. So these guys, they get $80,000 for this one group to come and hunt bantang. The first thing they have to do is to collect all the dung that's all over the place, and around the airport and everything. Then they have to shoo the bantang into the bush and stop them from coming out, just chewing the cud. And they select out an elderly, very elderly and lame male bantang as the one for the hunter, and then they keep the hunters from finding them for 2 nights. They go, and then on the last night, this bantang is wheeled out with encouragement and shot, and then and they had these pictures of this guy standing with his gun over the bantang. That again seemed to me a lovely kind of example of the sort of thing that you were raising. Yes, we've got another question here. Question over there.
I grew up in a part of Kansas where most boys hunt.
Right.
And my observation has been that some love to go out and just kill indiscriminately the way that you described, and others kind of do it because it's expected and they may like the guns, but they're not that into killing things. Do you think there's something innate in the human male that wants to let blood all over the place? Or is that part of your
That's a
part of your exploration here?
It's a terrifically good question. If there is, I never had it, which may try and explain. And I'm not sure, for example, why my father had a very tough life in East Africa. He grew up, and his uncle lived just around the corner. They lived with guns. Actually, my mother shot for South Africa in 12 bore in the Olympics, and my father still holds a record for pistol shooting in the Bisley. But neither of them had any interest in killing animals. In fact, they were the other way around. They were besotted with animals, and so were we. So I can't understand. And nobody was tougher than my father. He won the Military Cross twice, and he was run over by a Bren gun carrier during the war. And he was also in a light plane crash when I was 10. So he was smashed up to pieces, and he had polio as well, paralyzed him down one side, and he still, toughed his way through, played rugby after he'd had polio. So there was all that masculinity, which I found very hard to cope with, but it never expressed itself in killing animals. Now, it's a mystery. You're asking a really important question. I honestly don't know why people hunt. But it was very interesting to me that the difference with women, even when women were very good hunters, and they would hunt often either because their husbands wanted them to, or to prove that they were just as tough or just as accurate as their husbands. No, it was a kind of an expression in some senses of feminism. But they also had this tremendously powerful nurturing. All of these women adopted young animals at some point or another in their lives. And the weird thing about Roosevelt is that he was very loving with his kids. He was a wonderful father in one sense. He loved the pets. But he actually seems to hate the animals because he's seeing them as enemy. He's actually he's imagining that he's at war. These are the people who have come to kill him, and he's going to kill them first. And it doesn't matter where, there is no sense of sportsmanship in ethos. And as a conservationist, I'll tell you the story, the worst of his crimes, which was the northern white rhino, which is now extinct. At the time when he wanted to get a white rhino, there were probably perhaps about several hundred still alive. That's all. They were already known to be on the skids in 1910, and they were forbidden to hunt them in British East Africa. So he persuaded the Congo to let him go into the Congo, where there were no rules at all about hunting. And he killed 9 white rhino. 2 of them were pregnant cows. 1 of them was a calf, and he wounded but didn't kill 2 other calves. Now, this man is consistently praised as a great sportsman. I took 2 examples of the most recent books on Roosevelt as a conservationist and hunter. One published by University of Chicago Press this year, last year, and another one just published this year, in which they say his hunting was all part of his love of animals and his great conservation. So you know, the whistle has not been blown on Roosevelt. He's a very popular president and an extremely likable man in many ways. A progressive and delightful father. His letters to his kids are a model of caring father. But, you know, something has to be said about this masculinity thing because, as you rightly point out, Walter it is, isn't it? Your name? Well, you rightly point out it's still going on. You know, there is... And the white rhinos are now duly extinct. Thank you, Teddy. You know, because, of course, a large number of other people wanted to imitate him. So Eastman Kodak, when he comes out with a massive expedition in cars, he drove up to lions in his Buick and would even bump them and shoot them from the window. But he had to get white rhino because Ted had. So they, you know, enormously costly. They hardly could find a white rhino, but he managed to get one. So it's sort of imitating this model.
So this is a question about, I think, maybe the connection between what you are arguing about masculinity and trophy hunting and how the anticipation of the hunting being some kind of emblem of national identity. Nationalism, and so I'm wondering if you could somehow comment on how the anticipation of this specimen may or may not have contributed to that transformative safari. You know, thinking about, and the other supporting thing that I heard this morning from you was he was willing to sacrifice sons for country.
Yeah.
And encouraging. So in that way, the connection between love and sacrifice, what that means in terms of establishing a cultural icon that would be visible to.
You know, just one sort of immediate answer is that in his trophy room at Sagamore Hill, which was built like a cathedral in a way, with a cathedral ceiling, and had a kind of sacral element in it. He, beside the animals on the wall, he has the remnants of his youngest son's aeroplane, because he was killed the youngest son was killed in the First World War. In fact, his oldest son was the most wounded man in the Second World War, the most wounded. He died at the end from his wounds, but apparently nobody had greater wounds in any and survived in any of the armies. Of course, Kermit blows out his brains at the end of the Second World War. The third son, Archibald, had to be what do you call it when you're taken out for medical reasons from the war? Both from the First World War and the Second, he had to be removed for medical reasons because he'd been so smashed up. So that this desire to prove that they were their father's sons, was at the destruction of their body. And then, he has the emblems of their death beside the animals in the Sagamore Hill. I mean, it's really very, very bizarre. Of course, when his son actually died, Quentin actually died in the war, he was devastated. I mean, he publicly said, "I would never change it, that I do not regret for a moment that he died, because he died for his country, and there could be no greater thing that you can achieve." And he himself tried to get another group of Rough Riders in the First World War so he could go out. At that point, aged 70 or something, and Woodrow Wilson refused to let him. And he wrote back and said, "I do not know why you refuse me. All I want to do is die." I mean, so this is this. I mean, it's not a direct answer to your question, because in a way I haven't got on top of that issue. But the trophy thing is so important, and the measuring of, whether the horns are. If you want to get obsession with sort of trophies, you and the sort of size of the horn and so on, it's still going on by the time Hemingway's shooting. I mean, he's as obsessed with masculinity and in fact, Hemingway's take on hunting was that I asked nothing of the animals that hadn't been done to me in war. So there is this continual connection between war and hunting. And emblems of war, of course. I mean, I regret to say that my father had a watch that he took off a Japanese person that he shot during the war, and various other things that he'd picked up, field glasses and things. These are sort of trophies, So the whole business of trophy, I think, is very, very important to understand. I mean, it goes without saying that serial killers keep trophies of the humans they kill. It's a well-known factor. So what is this? What is this need? I mean, partly, of course, the trophy is to reenact the experience. The trophy gives you that chance. But it is also a trigger for boasting to other people and storytelling. So Roosevelt would always take people into and tell them one by one about his heroic deeds and shooting these different animals. And I guess that's part of the function of trophy. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is actually a follow-up to the last two anyway. I'm struck by ironies on top of ironies and in all of these stories, and that's one reason stories are very good for that, aren't they? One is the crossbow hunter who killed Cecil the lion. The bow hunting movement, to an extent, started. Aldo Leopold and Estella Leopold founded the Bow Hunting Society of Wisconsin as important conservationists because they overtly thought that we went back to Pleistocene weapons. They actually recalled it that.
Yes.
That we'll be able to live in Pleistocene harmony with these creatures. And that then leads to my question. You titled your talk TR's Anthropocene. And I would love to hear you comment on what you mean by that. I imagine some people may have not even heard of the Anthropocene concept before. I'd love to hear your take on what the essential interest of that concept is and how the activities of someone like TR or the dentist hunting the Cecil the lion exemplify creating this new geological era.
Yes. Obviously, it's a kind of provocative statement. The Anthropocene, the idea of the Anthropocene, for those who don't know it, you will because it's in the ether now, is that we have entered a new age where for the first time we have become physical forces of nature. that we are actually changing the environment in ways that geologists will be able to see hundreds and thousands of years from now. They'll be able to say, because in this rock, this is the era of the Anthropocene, when humans had reached the point that they had become physical forces of nature, able to overwhelm existing physical forces and supplant themselves. And in a way, that's my story about Roosevelt. I mean, the first irony I found, when he's traveling on that train, and he meditates about the Pleistocene, and I'm grateful for your comment about Leopold. I'll go and look that up. He's saying we're going back into the world of a kind of primitive Eden where the animals can. So they're sitting in front of the train, animals all about. He's instructed the driver, if he sees a lion, to stop immediately so that Roosevelt can shoot it. Thank heaven they didn't see a lion. But he was entranced by the fact that when the line was laid, it was known as the lunatic line, partly because so many people died in the process. There were more than 150 of the workers died, a very large number of them from being killed by two man-eating lion. And Roosevelt was so excited at the possibility that he would find one of these wild beasts and be able to kill them from the train from the moment he arrives. So as soon as he's arriving in the Pleistocene, he's coming as an agent of transforming it. And he makes that quite clear. He says he's an imperialist, and he lectures. The settlers loved him, the white settlers and the imperialists, because he is an imperialist. He believes that man is innately imperial, that you have to learn to fight, you have to expand your terrain, your territory. Recently done so in the Philippines and in the Spanish-American territories. And so, and he's riding in this Baldwin train, which is heading, this is your point, that line was built, this enormous line was built from Mombasa on the coast to Nairobi, and it was built to make a colony. There was nobody there. At the time when the line was made, there's literally only the workers. There were no settlers. Nobody had penetrated, and then so they created a colony through the train line. And this train is an emblem of the Anthropocene. I think it's very much your own work is heading in this way. Trains are transformative, and from that time the colony was created, and as was it got you into Uganda as well. That's where it finished. So it created two colonies that had no white people, but they went through the White Highlands. And Roosevelt says, this place is perfect. Not only is it the Pleistocene animals to shoot, but it is a perfect place for white men to establish a colony because it's high and it's healthy, good land. And they're exactly like the Western. These are the people that won the West, can now win British East Africa. It was, and this analogy is throughout all his work and his talks. So, and I think he is an agent of the Anthropocene in that the safari really put those countries on the map in tourist terms, and the hunting. He helped very, very much helped the growth of the settlement. One of the things people don't know about British East Africa is an enormous number of Americans went to live there, many of them extremely wealthy and very important to the life of the colony because of Roosevelt. And so he's an agent of the Anthropocene both for the settlement, and the settlement meant that they drove the Kikuyu out of their land because they were farmers and took over their lands in the highlands and foreshadowed, I suppose, the future Mau Mau in that sense. They were agent of the Anthropocene in the destruction of animals themselves because they created a culture, safari culture, a vogue for safaris that swept the world and continues to this day. I mean, the only thing that's modified it a bit is the camera, and that is an important element in it. But he's an agent of the Anthropocene because he wants to civilize this Pleistocene. And by civilize, he means he wants white men to occupy the land and transform it. And he said you should make reserves for some animal in the land that is uninhabitable by whites. You should put the blacks, and you should then put animals in difficult land too, as long as you at least keep some land that's accessible for elite hunters. So there really, I'm suggesting, I mean, he didn't know about the Anthropocene, but what he is doing is supplanting nature. He is a force that is transformative of everything that has happened in East Africa since, I think. I mean, I'm pushing it a bit, obviously. I like the play on Pleistocene and Anthracene. But I think it's true, and it's not a... I mean, I don't go out as a hater of Roosevelt. I had no feelings about him one way or the other than the elephant thing. But reading it, he has had a very deleterious impact, or he is an emblem of a deleterious impact on East Africa. And so that's why I use the term Anthropocene.
Maybe I'm tending to romanticize, but a lot of the examples you've used about the horrible things, in my opinion, are Americans. And I'm just thinking from my reading, and I'm not a hunter, and I'm Scottish descent, but not really from Scotland. But, when I think of John Buchan's book, John McNabb, and the attitude of the hunters toward the animals, and they were just so careful, of the type of animal that you hunt, and even the fish, and I just, is all this yucky stuff, is this just American? And I mean, that would be something very interesting, I think, to look at in your book, to me, it's just an idealized version of these noble Scottish hunters and fishermen that were, that have a really respect for nature, total respect for it. I don't know. I just wondered what you thought about that.
No, it's a good question. I don't think it is any specifically American at all, although there is this phenomenon of a certain number of nostalgic people in America who feel that hunting has become impossible. There's no longer bison, very few cougar, and so on, that did come to do that. But it's perfectly true that there was a strong sportsman's ethic of what you could do and couldn't do in America. And in fact, this is the irony of it. Roosevelt founded the Boone and Crockett Club. He was one of the co-founders, which was for ethical hunting, and it had all these prescriptions on you don't hunt, you never kill a calf, you don't kill female animals, you've got to get close enough so that you can get a shot that kills them cleanly, you must never let them be wounded. He would start firing at animals at 300 yards. I mean, you could barely see them. And so he would clip them in the back of the leg, and they always would be wounded in some way. And a lot of the time, of course, Uncle Les had to then go off into the bush and try and finish off a half-wounded lion. Roosevelt wasn't afraid. He was unafraid of anything. You can't say that there was any sort of fearful, he's a fearless man. But there was this ferocity in him I don't think is typical. necessarily. I mean, I do think there were ethical hunters, quite a number of them, even though it still remains to be seen why you need to kill animals for trophies. I can understand why animals sometimes have to be culled, because they can damage the environment so much that other animals die, and they get out of kilter. I can understand why culling does occur, so I'm not against that. But I am against trophy hunting. I can't see what is the value in it. Now, naturalist hunters would argue that they were actually partly in the early days making a living from hunting. So they were getting ivory and selling ivory, and so making a living. At least there was a purpose in it. And certainly there was a very strong animal ethical hunting sets of codes. And eventually, in fact, in 1933, the East African Professional Hunting Association was formed by hunters to impose game regulations, because they thought it had just got completely out of control. And it banned the hunting from cars, which had become, driving up in the Buick and shooting them, animals, slaughtering it. It banned shooting animals around water holes where they're, animals themselves don't attack each other around water holes, except crocs. So, if you set up by a water hole, they're absolutely dependent on water. Then you can just slaughter them, like shooting fish in a barrel, as they say. So your point is true. I mean, Selous, who's a sort of old-fashioned hunter, more like the Pleistocene type hunters, became very. A lot of them become very concerned about the fact that they hunted more than they needed to, and most of them gave it up and became conservationists to some degree, because they had some empathy for the animal. The thing that's missing in Roosevelt is he had absolutely no empathy. It's because you often hear hunters saying, I was appalled, the animal wasn't properly killed. It made me feel sick. And then I tell the story of Akeley. Akeley has a conversion, who was on that initial elephant hunt. He goes to hunt gorillas, and he's the first person to photograph them, and gorillas in the Congo. Anyway, he's shooting gorillas to stuff them and put them in the American Museum of Natural History, and he shoots a mother, and then there's a little baby gorilla, and it comes to him, and it's wounded, and it jumps up to try and cuddle him. And he is devastated. So he gives up hunting and becomes the conservationist who agitated for what is now the great game reserve, where all the where the Goddard and Schaller and all those books have been about primates, chimps and gorillas have been made on that, with the Virungas as it was then. So you do get this whole business of the penitent hunter becoming a conservationist, sometimes because they just get revolted by something like that, or sometimes because they're just worried that the animals are disappearing. So I don't think, this is not a block condemnation of hunting in the book. I'm interested more in this particular ethos of a sort of masculine ferocity, I suppose, which is exhibited so much by this very, very influential man, Roosevelt.
As a historian of modern Europe, I'm very struck hearing this framing of Teddy Roosevelt, who we, I think, in the United States have remembered as a progressive, as a conservationist. The framings and themes you're bringing up, he sounds like a fascist. I mean, he's talking about this cult of self-mythologizing masculinity. He's talking about expansionism, the role of violence as a realization of self, as well as a sort of social structuring ideal. I mean, it's quite striking that he has these two very different legacies and halves of himself in some way.
I see him as a Jekyll and Hyde character in a way, because there is that the other side you mention is perfectly true. I mean, he is a great conservationist. He was a naturalist. He knew a great deal about animals, and he had an extraordinary, almost photographic memory, so that he would remember all the details of animals. And he wrote a book about animal behavior, a series of books with a zoologist after African game trails, which was about behavior, but it's almost unread. It didn't attract in the way that African game trails attracts, which is full of blood and thunder. So yeah, he's a Jekyll and Hyde, and he's a very loving. I mean, his letters to his children, and they're boys, you know. I mean, he calls his son Quentin, Quentikins, my darling Quentikins, you know. And this is the boy he sends off to get killed in the First World War. So there's something absolutely warped about the masculinity and about the belief that it was necessary, a sort of social Darwinian belief, that men must learn to be virile and aggressive and fearless, because otherwise America will fail in the struggle between nations. And so that's really a kind of particularly a rather fascist element in a man who was very progressive in all sorts of other ways and very likable in all sorts of other ways.
How do you anticipate, or what response do you anticipate when you come out with this alter image of the great President Theodore Roosevelt?
Yeah, that's a good question. I imagine, I can imagine that, you know, I will get lots of not so friendly letters from the people in the American Rifle Association. Yeah, it's true. I don't think people will like it at all. Yeah, I'm sure, because in some ways it's eroding an idol, an American idol, and as I say, an American idol who at least deserves all sorts of admiration. But why it was necessary, and has always been necessary, for biographers to rationalize this safari or just go over it as though it didn't happen. I mean, you know, they ended up actually killing over 1,000 animals in this safari. Now, it was all done under the aegis of science. The Smithsonian Institution didn't want him to go, but he said, if you don't let me lead this exhibition, I'm going to go to the National American Museum of Natural History. So they wanted the publicity. And as a result, an expedition is sent. It extracts over 1,000 animals and birds from East Africa. I think they found one small mouse that was new to nature. Those were the actual zoologists, and there was only one paper written as a result. The zoologists found it very difficult to say anything new about the expedition, and the stuff was unwanted in the museum. So a large amount of it, actually some of it's still in crates, apparently, or at least it was about 10 years ago. It's not even opened. And so much so, I mean, he got these large numbers of animals that are very common, like lion and elephant and so on, and sends the skins and the skeletons to the museum when he gets back. And Heller, who'd gone on the expedition with him, the zoologist, is in a really embarrassed situation because the museum don't want them. Or they just say, oh, we'll put them in a room. And Teddy Roosevelt is furious. He wants them out on display. And the only way they appeased him in the end is they gave them back to him so he could use them for trophies. So the expedition itself is a front. It's a fig leaf, which enabled him to shoot animals to an extent that he would never have been as a private citizen, even if he was president. But he did it under the aegis of science, and that's another aspect of the whole thing that is a sort of Anthropocene story where science itself helps generate the problem that it's now trying to solve. You're a very good question, though. I have shivers going up and down my spine when I think about the reception. Yeah, I won't be invited back to Kansas.
One back there.
Have you been to the museum in Chanute, Kansas? The Safari Museum? I wondered. Yeah, because I thought you would enjoy all the footage.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
I went the day after I arrived. It was the day before yesterday, I think. Yeah, I went straight down there. It's an extraordinary museum. I mean, this is the museum, if you don't know it, of Martin and Osa Johnson, who were very early documentary filmmakers, and much involved with my uncle as well. They do feature in the book, though not as largely, because they weren't part of this circle. Though they did do some hunting, particularly Osa. She was a much keener hunter than Martin.
This dilemma of portrayals of heroes, I think, also speaks to one of the dilemmas around the way the Anthropocene concept has been perceived. Because one of the critiques that actually arrived relatively early on from a humanities point of view was that there was a profound triumphalism underlying the idea of humans being geological agents. And the fascinates me when you scratch beneath the facade that it's the ugly underbelly of progress.
Yeah.
Because this was TR is the icon of progressivism from this era. Exactly. And I mean, this is an old story among especially Latin American historians like me who study the underbelly. But that's why not only TR is an interesting character and why this other side of him must be told. I mean, it's I think an ethical imperative, but also why the Anthropocene concept is interesting, because what value is a triumph in which we're left with an ash heap?
Yes, exactly. That's beautifully put. Yes, you're right. Anthropocene has a real problem, and one of the ways people are trying to solve it, that's the other thing, is the movement for geoengineering the climate. So by further human interventions, of some of them are cosmic ideas of changing the direction of the sun's rays and all kinds of other things, which are meant to repair the damage of us that we've done physically, and some of them are quite chilling. I mean, they're intended to be a way of solving the problem, but almost certainly would make it worse. And you're quite right. I mean, there is this one sense, well, if we have become forces of nature, well then let's use our force to repair the situation that we've done. But I mean, that kind of hubris. I mean, it's also the sort of hubris that, introduced cane toads to Australia, and the cane toads are now unstoppable. They've moved from, they've moved right up from the north, and the cane toads are now have almost reached Sydney and Melbourne. And the cane toads are unstoppable. No one can get rid of them. They're poisonous. Dogs eat them and die. Birds eat them and die. They seem to be impervious to anything except baseball bats. You see people driving their cars like this to run over cane toads, which is gross as well. But that was one of the interventions of the kind that worries me in this whole Anthropocene story, where geoengineering is seen as the way we're going to solve it. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, was involved with, the geoengineers are almost science fiction author type defense industry guys.
Yes.
One of our colleagues here, Joe Nagel, who's been writing a book about climate change science, has been fascinated by this boys and their toys iconography that goes along with this. And I think there's something to pointing out that a masculinist ethic underlies progressivism.
Yes.
Underlies the forces that create the Anthropocene, and that might be a point that you want to make in connecting this. It's
I think
an
it's
ideal
also
vehicle for
absolutely true. And the other thing I haven't said, but it goes without saying, that Teddy was obsessed with guns, absolutely obsessed. I mean, the pages and pages of letters describing the different bore and the kind of bullets and the different kinds of guns. And that too is, it seems to me, as a crass outsider, a very grave American problem, the cult of the gun. And, it's connected in that sense very much with masculinity. Even though, it's defended as, well, helpless women need to have a gun to shoot somebody. And that may well be true if everyone has guns. If enough people have guns, then everyone does need to have guns. But it is, I mean, he's revered by the National Rifle Association as a kind of emblem of everything good that they stand for. So it's just another issue, I think, that one has to face.